For 16 years, Jackson Mahomes kept a secret about his brother Patrick that could have completely changed the history of American football. A secret so profound that not even his own parents knew the truth behind the meteoric rise of one of the NFL's greatest stars. When Jackson finally decided to reveal what happened that night in 2009, the entire Mahomes family was left in absolute shock. What you're about to discover will forever change how you see the Mahomes Dynasty in football. The Mahomes family home in Kansas City was filled with the familiar aroma of roasted turkey and sweet potatoes seasoned with cinnamon. It was Thanksgiving 2025, and the Mahomes family had gathered as they had for decades, keeping alive a tradition that not even the relentless demands of the NFL could break. The mahogany dining room table comfortably seated 8 people, but that night only 6 chairs were occupied. Patrick Mahomes adjusted his casual navy blue shirt while cutting small pieces of turkey for his children, Sterling and Bronze, who chattered animatedly about school. Brittany smiled while serving more cranberry sauce, her golden earrings catching the soft light from the chandelier. Across the table, Jackson Mahomes observed the scene with a look that Pat Sr., his father, had begun to notice in recent weeks. A mixture of contemplation and restlessness that didn't match his normally carefree son. "Jackson, you've barely touched your food," commented Randy Martin, her voice carrying that maternal concern that never disappears, no matter how old the children are. "Is everything all right, honey?" Jackson raised his eyes from his plate, meeting his mother's caring gaze. At 25 years old, he had developed the same confident posture that characterized all the Mahomes men. But in that moment, something in his expression reminded them of the shy preteen who used to stand in his older brother's shadow during interviews. "Actually, Mom," Jackson paused, placing his fork carefully beside his plate. The metallic sound against the porcelain seemed to echo louder than it should have. "There's something I need to talk to you all about. Something that I've been keeping for a very long time." The change in atmosphere was immediate and palpable. Patrick stopped cutting food for the children, his intense eyes, identical to his brother's, focusing completely on Jackson. Pat Sr. leaned slightly forward, his hands intertwined on the table, while Randy felt her stomach tighten with that maternal intuition that always anticipated important moments. "Like, how long are we talking here?" Patrick asked, trying to maintain a casual tone, but his voice betrayed growing concern. Jackson took a deep breath, the air seeming heavy in his lungs. He looked around the table, memorizing each face, each expression, knowing this would be the last moment before everything changed. 16 years, he said finally, his voice low but clear. "Since I was 9, and you were 14. The silence that followed was different from any quietude that house had ever experienced. It wasn't the comfortable silence of a satisfied family after a meal, nor the natural pause between conversations. It was the kind of silence that precedes revelations that redefine relationships. Brittany instinctively pulled Sterling and Bronze closer, her maternal instincts activated even without fully understanding what was happening. The children, sensing the change in the adult's mood, stopped chattering and looked curiously at Uncle Jackson. 16 years, Pat Sr. repeated, his deep voice carrying decades of experience as a father and former professional athlete. He had been through difficult situations, complicated conversations, pressure moments in packed stadiums. But something in Jackson's expression warned him this would be different. Jackson nodded slowly. "I know this is going to sound strange, and I know you're all going to wonder why I waited so long. But there are some things that happened when we were kids. Things that completely changed how I saw our family, our situation, and especially," he looked directly at Patrick, "how I saw my role as your younger brother." Patrick felt his heart accelerate. He and Jackson had always been close despite the natural dynamics that existed between brothers with different paths. They had shared dreams, disappointments, and victories. The idea that Jackson had kept something significant for 16 years was both disturbing and intriguing. "Jackson," Randy said softly, extending her hand across the table to touch her son's. "Whatever it is, we'll understand. You're our son, and there's nothing that can change that." Jackson's eyes glistened with an emotion he had kept repressed for a long time. "I know, Mom. You've always been incredible to me, to all of us." Maybe that's exactly why it was so hard to talk about this, because what I did, the decision I made back then, was thinking about protecting our family. About protecting Patrick. "Protecting me from what?" Patrick asked, his voice now loaded with urgency. "Jackson, man, what are we talking about here?" Jackson closed his eyes for a moment, gathering courage. When he opened them again, there was a determination that hadn't been there before. "Do you remember when you all used to say we were lucky to have so much natural talent for football? That it was like a family gift?" Everyone around the table nodded. It was a familiar conversation, part of the Mahomes mythology that had been repeated in countless interviews and documentaries. "Well," Jackson continued, his voice now firmer, "the truth is that not everything was luck or natural talent. And the reason I never told this before," he paused, looking again at Patrick, "is because I didn't want this to change how you all see Patrick's achievements, because they are his, completely his. But the way they began, well, that involves a choice I made when I was 9 years old." The tension in the room was almost tangible. Now, Pat Sr. felt transported back to his own days as a professional athlete, when he anticipated decisive plays, moments that could determine the outcome of entire games. But this was different. This was about his family, his children, and secrets that apparently had shaped their lives in ways he had never imagined. "A choice?" Brittany asked gently, her voice cutting through the tension. "What kind of choice, Jackson?" Jackson looked at her with gratitude. Brittany had always been good at asking the right questions, at the right moments, a skill that made difficult situations a little easier to navigate. "The kind of choice," Jackson said, his voice loaded with emotion, "that a younger brother makes when he realizes he has the power to influence his older brother's future. The kind of choice that, well, that defines the rest of our lives." He paused, looking around the table once more. "And before I tell everything, I need you all to know that I don't regret it, not for a second. But carrying this alone for so long, it was harder than I ever imagined it would be." Patrick extended his hand across the table, covering his brother's. "Jackson, whatever it is, we'll face it together, like we always have." Jackson smiled for the first time that night, a genuine expression that lit up his face. "Thank you, Patrick. That means everything to me." The Thanksgiving dinner had transformed into something much more significant, and everyone around the table knew they were about to discover something that would redefine their understanding of the Mahomes family and the extraordinary journey that had brought them there. The autumn air in Tyler, Texas carried the familiar scent of dry leaves and the promise of another football season. At the Mahomes family house, the daily routine revolved around training schedules, school games, and the constant symphony of footballs spiraling in the backyard. Jackson Mahomes, then 9 years old, was sitting on the porch, watching Patrick, 5 years older but already visibly stronger, practicing passes on the makeshift field that Pat Sr. had set up in the backyard. Even from a distance, Jackson could see the natural fluidity of Patrick's movement. The way the football seemed like an extension of his hands. "That boy is special," Pat Sr. had commented a few weeks earlier, after watching Patrick completely dominate a game against boys 2 years older. "He has something that can't be taught." At that time, Jackson was beginning to show interest in sports, but he was realizing there was a fundamental difference between being enthusiastic about football and having that rare gift that transforms spectators into believers. The back door opened and Patrick entered, sweaty and radiant after the impromptu training session. "Jackson, did you see those passes I practiced today?" Coach Smith said that if I keep improving at the current pace, I can get a scholarship to any university I want. Jackson smiled at his brother, but felt a familiar tightness in his chest. It wasn't exactly envy. It was something more complex. It was the growing awareness that Patrick was destined for something greater, and that the entire family was beginning to reorganize their priorities around this potential. "That's incredible, Patrick," Jackson said genuinely. "You deserve all the opportunities that come your way." A few days later, Jackson overheard a conversation that would change everything. It was between Pat Sr. and Marcus Williams, a talent scout who had noticed Patrick during a regional youth game a few weeks earlier. "Pat, I have an interesting proposal for your family," Marcus said, his voice professional but friendly. "There's a football academy in Dallas, the Elite Gridiron Academy, that's offering full scholarships to promising young talents." They saw Patrick's stats and were impressed. Jackson, listening from the hallway, felt his heart race. The Elite Gridiron Academy was known for developing players who later got full university scholarships and eventually made it to the NFL. "The program is intensive," Marcus continued. 3 years of elite training, first-class academic education, and exposure to college scouts. But there's a small problem. They only have one spot available, and they need an answer by the end of the week. "One spot?" Pat Sr. asked. "Yes, and here's the interesting part. They're also considering another young player from the region for the same position. Apparently, someone alerted them about his talent too." Jackson felt the world stop. He knew without any doubt that if Patrick was considered for this opportunity, he would be chosen. The 14-year-old boy already showed signs of being a prodigy. "Can we think about it?" Pat Sr. asked. "Of course, but this could be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for Patrick." That night during dinner, Jackson observed his family. Pat Sr. was telling a story about his own MLB days, gesticulating animatedly while describing a particularly memorable pitch. Randy laughed, her eyes shining with the pride she always showed when talking about her husband's achievements. Patrick listened attentively, absorbing every word as if they were sacred lessons. And it was in that moment that Jackson made a decision that would shape the next 16 years of his life. The next morning, Jackson approached his father privately. "Dad, about that academy thing, I think Patrick should go. He's special in a way I'll never be." "Jackson, you're only 9 years old," Pat Sr. said, surprised by his son's seriousness. "You don't need to worry about this." "I know, Dad, but if they really want the best player, Patrick is the obvious choice. I'm fine where I am." After the conversation, Pat Sr. called Marcus Williams and emphasized Patrick's potential. 3 weeks later, Patrick received a call from the Elite Gridiron Academy. The entire family celebrated as if it were a miracle, an opportunity that had emerged from nowhere that could catapult young Patrick. Pat Sr. and Randy spent nights discussing whether it would be right to allow Patrick, at 14 years old, to move to Dallas. Eventually, they decided the opportunity was too big to waste, but that the entire family would move to support him. "It's like the universe is conspiring in Patrick's favor," Randy commented one night while packing the family's things. Jackson, listening from the stairs, smiled sadly. It wasn't the universe conspiring. It was a younger brother making the choice to put his older brother's potential above his own future involvement in football. In the months that followed the move to Dallas, Jackson watched Patrick flourish at the Elite Gridiron Academy. The boy who was already talented in Tyler became truly extraordinary under the tutelage of world-class coaches. His skills were refined, his confidence grew, and his reputation began to spread through youth football circles. Meanwhile, Jackson adapted to a new school, made new friends, and focused on other interests, but always with the silent awareness that he had influenced a path that could have included him differently. The weight of this decision wasn't something he carried with bitterness. In fact, watching Patrick prosper gave him deep and genuine satisfaction. But it also created a layer of complexity in his identity that he didn't know how to express to the family. How could he explain that he had deliberately redirected the course of their lives? How could he tell them that the miracle that had led Patrick to the elite academy wasn't really a miracle, but the silent influence of a brother? And as the years passed and Patrick continued to reach increasingly impressive milestones, the secret became harder to reveal. Not because Jackson regretted it, but because he didn't want anyone to question whether Patrick's achievements were really his, because they were completely. Jackson had merely opened a door. Patrick had walked through it with his own talent, dedication, and brilliance. But this distinction, as clear as it was to Jackson, wouldn't necessarily be obvious to others, and protecting the purity of Patrick's achievements had become a silent mission that Jackson had carried for 16 years. The final whistle echoed through Darrell K. Royal Texas Memorial Stadium, and Patrick Mahomes had just thrown for 400 yards against Oklahoma, taking Texas Tech to a bowl game for the first time in years. Jackson was in the stands, cheering until his voice went hoarse, watching his older brother accomplish something that few 20-year-olds could: capture the imagination of an entire country. While Patrick was carried by his teammates, Jackson felt a familiar mixture of immense pride and a silent weight he had learned to carry. "That kid's going to make it to the NFL," shouted a fan near Jackson. "He's too special not to make it." Jackson smiled and agreed, but felt that familiar pang of complexity. Patrick was special. That had never been questionable. But the trajectory that had led him to that moment, well, that was more complicated. After the game, during the family celebration at a local restaurant, Pat Sr. raised a toast. "To Patrick, who shows us every day that dreams really do come true when you have talent and work hard." "To Patrick," everyone repeated, raising their glasses. Jackson drank and smiled, but silently added his own mental toast. "To the choices we make for the people we love." Arrowhead Stadium, Kansas City, February 2020. Red and gold confetti fell from the ceiling like celebratory rain. Patrick had just led the Kansas City Chiefs to their first Super Bowl championship in 50 years, and Arrowhead Stadium was in complete ecstasy. Jackson was on the field, hugging his brother, feeling tears stream down his face. "We did it, man!" Patrick shouted over the deafening noise. "We really did it!" Jackson hugged him tighter, his voice choked with emotion. "You did it, Patrick. This is yours, completely yours." Later that night, during the family's private party, Jackson found himself alone on the balcony of his parents' house in Kansas City, looking at the city lights. The party continued inside, laughter, music, and stories being told and retold about the magical season that had just ended. Randy appeared on the balcony, bringing 2 glasses of champagne. "Are you okay, honey?" she asked, offering him a glass. "You seem thoughtful for a celebration night." Jackson accepted the champagne and took a small sip. "I'm fine, Mom. Just processing everything." "I guess it's surreal, isn't it?" Randy said, joining him in contemplating the view. "Sometimes I look at Patrick and still see that 14-year-old boy who moved with us to Dallas to chase a crazy dream." Jackson almost choked on the champagne. You remember that time?" "How could I forget? It was one of the hardest decisions Pat and I ever made. Leaving Tyler, starting a new life, all based on the hope that Patrick could become something special." She paused, looking at her son. "Sometimes I wonder how our lives would have been different if that opportunity at the academy had never appeared." Jackson felt his stomach tighten. "Different how?" Well, maybe Patrick never would have received the elite training that prepared him for Texas Tech. Maybe you would have had more opportunities to shine in your own way instead of always being in your older brother's shadow. She touched Jackson's arm gently. I know that couldn't have been easy for you, honey. Mom, Jackson began, but the words were lost. How could he explain that the luck that had changed their lives wasn't really luck? How could he tell her that he had silently orchestrated the redirection of the family's destiny? Jackson, Randy continued, I want you to know that we're equally proud of you. Your own path, your career in social media, your creativity. You built something beautiful on your own. His mother's words were caring and well-intentioned, but each one added more weight to the secret Jackson carried, because the truth was that his own path had been shaped by a choice he made at 9. A choice that had indirectly defined the life course of the entire family. Miami Dolphins, Hard Rock Stadium, January 2023. Jackson was preparing a social media post before a Chiefs game when he received a call from Patrick. It was unusual for them to call each other before games, so Jackson answered immediately. Jackson, man, did you see the news? Patrick's voice was loaded with emotion. What news? ESPN just published an article about our family. They're calling us the Mahomes Dynasty and talking about how our rise was like an unlikely fairy tale. Jackson felt his stomach sink. Oh? They interviewed Mom and Dad, and there's a part where they talk about how it was miraculous that I received that opportunity at the elite Gridiron Academy when I was a kid, like it was destiny or something. Jackson closed his eyes, leaning against a wall. Patrick, and you know what's funny? I was thinking about that time, trying to remember exactly how that opportunity came up, and I can't remember the details. It seems foggy, you know? Sometimes memory gets confused when we're kids, Jackson said quickly. Yeah, maybe. But Jackson, sometimes I have this strange feeling that there are parts of our story that I don't completely understand, like there were layers that no one ever told me about. Jackson opened his eyes, looking at his reflection in a nearby mirror. 16 years. He had kept this secret for 16 years, and his brother was beginning to sense that something didn't fit perfectly. Patrick, Jackson said carefully, do you think it matters? I mean, regardless of how the opportunities came up, you're the one who did the work. You're the one who became the player you are. Of course it matters, Patrick replied. Not because I want credit for something I didn't do, but because, man, our family has always been about honesty, about authenticity. If there are parts of our story I don't understand, I'd like to understand them. That night, Jackson struggled to focus, his social media posts lacking their usual energy. After the game, sitting alone in his car in the stadium parking lot, he picked up his phone 3 times to call Patrick and tell him everything. But each time, he thought about the same thing. How could he explain that he had kept this for so long without it seeming like there was something wrong with his original motivation? Kansas City Chiefs, GEHA. Field at Arrowhead Stadium, April 2025. Jackson was going through one of the most reflective periods of his life. After a challenging year in the public eye, speculation about his role in Patrick's shadow was beginning to circulate. At 25 years old, he knew his path was different but meaningful. During a visit to his family in Kansas City, he found Pat Sr. organizing trophies and memorabilia in the home office. There were 2 shelves, one dedicated to Pat Sr.'s achievements during his MLB career, and another, significantly larger, for Patrick's accomplishments. Dad, Jackson said, entering the office, do you have room there for a few more things? Pat Sr. laughed. Of course, son. Your social media awards are still in the box you brought last year. I can organize a section for you, too. Jackson approached the shelves, observing Patrick's Super Bowl trophies, MVP awards, and other honors that told the story of an extraordinary career. "Dad," Jackson said softly, "do you ever wonder how things could have been different? I mean, if circumstances had changed when we were kids." Pat Sr. stopped organizing and looked at his son attentively. "Jackson, that doesn't sound like you. You've always been the one who embraces things as they are." "I know. It's just that—" Jackson paused, searching for the right words. "Sometimes I think about the choices people make and how those choices affect other people. How a small decision can change someone's entire life course." Pat Sr. approached his son, his expression concerned. "Jackson, is there something specific that's bothering you?" Jackson looked into his father's eyes, the same intense eyes that he and Patrick had inherited, and almost told everything. Almost explained about Marcus Williams, about the elite Gridiron Academy, about the decision a 9-year-old boy had influenced that had silently shaped the destiny of the entire family. But then he thought about Patrick, about his achievements, about the purity of his journey as everyone understood it. He thought about the clean and inspiring narrative that the Mahomes family represented to millions of people. "No, Dad," Jackson said finally. "I think I'm just going through a reflective time. Nothing I can't handle." Pat Sr. hugged him. "You know we're proud of you no matter what happens, right?" "I know, Dad. I know." But while Jackson returned the hug, he felt the familiar weight of 16 years of silence, a weight that had begun as an altruistic decision by a young boy and had transformed into something much more complex. A truth that could change how his family understood their own history, but that could also complicate the inspiring narrative they represented to the world. And as 2025 approached, Jackson began to realize that the weight of this secret had become almost unbearable. Not because he regretted his original choice, but because the love and unity of his family deserved complete honesty. It was time to trust that the love they shared would be strong enough to embrace a complex truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might initially be. The silence in the dining room seemed to extend for an eternity, although it had been only a few seconds. Jackson looked around the table, seeing his family's expressions, processing his words, and decided there was no turning back. "The elite Gridiron Academy," Jackson said, his voice now firmer, carried by the final resolution to release a secret kept for 16 years. "Patrick, do you remember when they called you offering that full scholarship when you were 14 years old?" Patrick nodded slowly. "Of course, it was. It was what changed everything for me." "They didn't call you first," Jackson revealed, each word coming out as if it were physically difficult. "They called Dad about another candidate, saying they had a spot available, but then they mentioned they were also looking at you." Patrick's expression gradually changed, going from confusion to growing understanding. "Jackson, I knew," Jackson continued, his words now flowing like repressed water finally released. "I knew that if they had to choose, they would choose you. Because even at 14 years old, Patrick, you were magical in a way I would never be. So I talked to Dad the next day and said they should focus completely on you." Randy brought her hand to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "Jackson, you were only 9 years old." "I was 9 years old and I saw an opportunity to do something for my older brother," Jackson said, looking directly at her. "Something that could completely change his life. And I don't regret it for a second, Mom. Not for a second." Pat Sr. leaned forward, his voice low but intense. "Son, you influenced a decision that gave up an opportunity for yourself." "I redirected an opportunity," Jackson corrected gently, "to where it could make the greatest possible impact. And look where it led us." He gestured around the table to the gathered family, to the life they had built. "Do you think I would do it differently if I could go back in time?" Patrick was silent, processing. His mind raced through memories, reconnecting events, seeing his childhood through a new lens. "Jackson, why did you never tell this?" Because Jackson took a deep breath. I didn't want this to change how you all see your achievements, Patrick. Every Super Bowl, every record, every magical moment you created, all of that is completely yours. Your talent, your dedication, your hard work. I just opened a door. You're the one who walked through it and built an empire. Patrick got up from his chair and walked around the table to Jackson. Without saying a word, he hugged his younger brother. And Jackson could feel Patrick's shoulders trembling slightly. "Jackson," Patrick whispered, his voice choked. "You influenced your own future for me when you were just a child." "It wasn't sacrifice," Jackson replied, returning the hug. "It was love. It was seeing my older brother with a gift that the world needed to witness and making sure nothing would stand in the way of that." Brittany wiped the tears from her face, her own maternal emotions touched by the depth of fraternal love she was witnessing. "Jackson, but carrying this alone for so long, it must have been unbearable at times." Jackson separated from Patrick, but kept his hands on his brother's shoulders. "There were difficult moments," he admitted, "especially when you all talked about how it was luck or destiny that led Patrick to the academy. Or when people said our family was blessed by luck. Because I knew it wasn't luck. It was a conscious choice made out of love." Pat Sr. stood up, walking to his two sons. His voice was thick with emotion when he spoke. "Jackson, what you did. I don't know many grown men who would make such a selfless choice, much less a 9-year-old boy." "Dad, you and Mom taught us that family comes first," Jackson said. "Always. You showed us through your own actions that sometimes love means putting others' needs before your own." Randy joined the group, creating a family hug that included all of them. "My dear Jackson," she said, her voice broken with emotion. "I'm so sorry you carried this weight alone. We should have created a space where you felt safe to share this." "No, Mom," Jackson said firmly. "It wasn't about you all. It was about me wanting to protect the purity of Patrick's journey because," he looked at Patrick again, "because I wanted to make sure that when the world looked at your achievements, they saw exactly what they are. The result of an extraordinary man's work who maximized every opportunity he received." Patrick wiped his eyes, his expression mixing gratitude with something that seemed like regret. "Jackson, but what about your own dreams? What if you had been part of that academy opportunity?" "And that's okay," Jackson said with a conviction that surprised even him. "Because I know exactly what happened with my choice. I saw my older brother become one of the greatest football players of all time. I saw our family unite around realized dreams. I saw millions of people get inspired by your story." He paused, looking around the table at each family member. "And most importantly, I saw what true love can create when there's no ego or competition in the way." Sterling, who had been quiet during the entire conversation, finally spoke with the direct honesty that only children possess. "Uncle Jackson, does this mean you're the reason why Daddy is famous?" The innocent question cut through all the emotional complexity of the moment, and for a second, everyone was silent. Then Jackson laughed, a genuine and liberating laugh. "No, Sterling," he said, crouching down to be at eye level with the girl. "Your daddy is famous because he's incredibly talented and worked harder than anyone I know. I just made sure he had the best possible chance to show that talent to the world." Bronze, not wanting to be left out, added his own perspective. "So you're like a secret superhero?" Jackson smiled, gently touching the boy's head. "No, buddy. I'm just a younger brother who loves his older brother very much." Pat Sr. cleared his throat, his voice still loaded with emotion. "Jackson, I want you to know something. The decision you made at 9 years old shaped not just Patrick's life, but all of our lives. And the fact that you carried this with such grace, such humility for so long, it fills me with a pride I don't even know how to express." "Dad," Jackson began. "No, let me finish," Pat Sr. continued. You influenced an opportunity, redirected the course of our entire family, and never, not once, let that create resentment or bitterness. That's not just maturity. That's the kind of character most people spend a lifetime trying to develop. Randy nodded, her tears now flowing freely. And the fact that you waited until now to tell us carried this weight to protect the perception of Patrick's achievements. Jackson, that's love at its purest level. Patrick was looking at Jackson with an expression that mixed admiration, gratitude, and something that seemed like reverence. Jackson, I don't know how to thank you for this. Not just for the decision you made when we were kids, but for protecting me from any complexity around it for all these years. You don't need to thank me, Patrick, Jackson said. You lived a life that completely honored that opportunity. You became not just a great player, but a great man, a great father, a great example. That's the greatest thanks I could ask for. Brittany, who had been observing the exchange between the brothers, finally spoke. Jackson, can I ask a question? Of course. Why now? After all these years, why did you decide to tell this now? Jackson paused, considering the question. Because I realized our family deserves complete honesty, and because I don't want there to be secrets between us anymore, even secrets that were kept with the best intentions. He looked around the table again. And because I finally understood that you all are strong enough to hear this story and see it for what it really is, a story about love, sacrifice, and family. Patrick approached Jackson again. Brother, the next time someone asks me about how our family got where we are, I'm going to tell this story because it doesn't diminish my achievements. It shows the kind of family that raised me, the kind of love that made everything possible. Patrick, you don't need to. Yes, I do, Patrick said firmly. Because this story is about us, all of us, and I don't want you to carry this alone anymore. Pat Sr. approached his two sons again. Boys, do you know that this conversation changes everything for me? How so, Dad? Jackson asked. Because now I understand that I didn't just raise an exceptional football player. I raised two exceptional men, one who had the character to sacrifice out of love, and another who had the grace to completely honor that sacrifice. The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't the tense silence of revelation. It was the contemplative silence of a family processing a profound truth about itself. Randy broke the silence. Jackson, honey, can I make you a promise? Of course, Mom. I promise that from now on, our family will be a place where truths like this can be shared without fear, where love is strong enough to embrace complexity. Jackson smiled, feeling for the first time in 16 years the complete relief of no longer carrying that weight alone. Thank you, Mom. That means everything to me. Sterling, still processing the adult's conversation with the simple logic of a child, made a final observation that perfectly summarized the moment. So, our family is even more special than I thought. Everyone laughed, the tension finally dissipating completely. Yes, Sterling, Jackson said, picking up the girl. Our family is very special because we're able to love each other enough to make difficult choices, and we're strong enough to embrace complicated truths. That night, after the children had gone to sleep and the dishes had been washed, Patrick and Jackson found themselves alone on the house's balcony, looking at Kansas City's lights shining in the distance. Jackson, Patrick said softly, thank you. For what? For giving me the chance to have the career I had, for protecting my perception of it for all these years, and for finally trusting our family enough to share the truth. Jackson smiled, feeling a weight he had carried for 16 years finally dissipating completely. Thank you for being the kind of man who completely honored that opportunity, Patrick, for becoming everything I saw in you when you were 14 years old. The two brothers remained in comfortable silence, contemplating not just the city lights, but the new chapter of honesty and understanding they had opened for their family. For Jackson, it was the end of a long period of protective silence and the beginning of a new phase where he could be completely himself within his own family. For Patrick, it was a new understanding of the depth of love that surrounded him and a renewed appreciation for the journey that had brought him there. And for the Mahomes family as a whole, it was confirmation that their love was strong enough to embrace complex truths and become even more united through complete honesty. The 16-year secret had finally been revealed, not as something that divided the family, but as something that demonstrated the extraordinary depth of their love and commitment to each other.